Mayor Brandon Scott's $163,000 SUV, purchased with taxpayer money, continues to draw scrutiny over government spending.
So this is Baltimore Mayor Brandon Scott, and you guys might be put off by the fact that Brandon Scott looks incredibly young. He looks like he's 20 years old, but I assure you the man is nearly 40 years old. He just happens to be an ageless wonder who unfortunately has found himself in a very similar controversy that many other mayors, specifically Democratic mayors, specifically black Democratic mayors, have found themselves in across the country, in that the expenses for his office seem wildly out of whack compared to other public officials, and in particular, the issue at hand here is the overwhelming cost for the vehicle that he drives as the official mayoral vehicle, where he's driven around in, actually, to be more accurate. And again, this reminds me so much of the super mayor and her infamous Chevy Tahoe.
To feed my people, from Vegas to Chicago, I rode around in Tahoe.
In which she negotiated terms so poorly that they were paying around $50,000 in interest for that vehicle.
I sat here and looked at a lease that y'all was paying $149,000 for one of them trucks. You make absolute, that's like when you 19 years old and you go get a car and the interest rate 27%. That makes absolutely no sense. You're
Please
not making
facts.
great finance, excuse me?
Please state facts.
But let me tell you, here it is, dated December 27, 2022. The cash price of a 2023 Chevy Tahoe, $93,216.71. Interest and APR, $55,929.49. Total lease price, $149,146.20. Tell me if it's not facts, because your signature is all on it.
I don't see that.
That obviously we have to talk about it today. We have to highlight this because when you look at the other officials in the state of Maryland, what you ultimately end up discovering is that Brandon Scott is spending way too much money, or has spent way too much money on his vehicle. And this is yet another example of the absurd corruption that we see in places like Baltimore. But before we get into that, I want to thank everybody who supports my much more sensible vehicle purchase over at actualjusticewarrior.com/join.
Mayor Brandon Scott says the 2025 Jeep Grand Wagoneer he uses serves the same purpose as the previous vehicles, to drive him around.
I think the residents of Baltimore will understand that the governor of Maryland, the comptroller of Maryland, the county executives, we all have vehicles.
So on October 1st of this year, Brandon Scott made the case that his vehicle purchase not out of line with the norm. One need only look at other politicians in and around this area and in the state of Maryland to figure out that these are official use vehicles, and his vehicle, again, even though it had some customizations, those are often done for other state officials and other city officials, other county officials, so this is not something you should be concerned about. Again, he's basically daring the local news media to look into the cost of these other officials' vehicles, and guess what? That monkey's paw wish definitely came true, because Brandon Scott ultimately ended up setting himself up for disaster, because guess what? When we look at the other vehicles from the city and from the county, what we ultimately end up discovering is that Brandon Scott's vehicle costs significantly more money than other comparable elected officials' vehicles, and by the way, some of them that are not comparable but actually in a disfavorable way to Brandon Scott, because those vehicles that they're in actually have to drive more to cover more ground than Brandon Scott does as the mayor of Baltimore.
But records obtained by Spotlight on Maryland found many of those vehicles come with much smaller price tags compared to Scott's $163,000 Jeep. Baltimore County Executive Kathy Klausmeyer's 2025 Chevrolet Suburban, about $77,000, including custom safety upgrades. Her backup vehicle, a 2021 Suburban, costs $70,000.
So those numbers are absolutely crazy. You see the other official, and what you find out is that her vehicle, with the customizations for security, including the sirens, costs about half, or actually less than half, than Brandon Scott's vehicle, and an older vehicle that was purchased back in the day, a 2021 that is used as a backup, costs around $70,000 at the time. But again, Brandon Scott's backup vehicle even beats that, in that it cost $99,000 at the time.
Mayor Scott's backup vehicle cost $99,000, a 2023 Ford Expedition.
Which again just shows the absolute disdain that these left-wing officials have for the taxpayer purse, because they're spending out the wazoo so that they could live in comfort, even though again, Brandon Scott drives significantly less than that other comparable official.
Klausmeyer's office tells us in a statement, in part, every purchase is made with an awareness of cost and optics, and with an understanding of how such decisions reflect on the responsible use of public funds. The emphasis is always on balancing fiscal responsibility with practical needs, reliability, and safety.
So we get a statement from the county official, and the county official's office ends up saying that it's a balancing act. Obviously, they need a vehicle in order to perform their duties. That vehicle needs certain security upgrades and whatnot, and customizations. However, you're trying to balance that against, again, the way that you're using taxpayer money so that you come out with a good result. And what we ultimately end up finding out, like I've alluded to multiple times already, is that that county official has a much greater surface area to cover as a county official than Brandon Scott does as, again, the mayor of Baltimore City. But this is laid out quite succinctly by this Fox 45 Baltimore segment right here for us.
Baltimore County covers a lot more ground than Baltimore City, 682 square miles compared to about 92 square miles, and about 285,000 more residents.
Now look, based on those numbers, it's absolutely inexcusable, but again, this Fox 45 segment goes even further. They look at a neighboring official and the vehicle that this official ends up riding around in, and what we ultimately end up finding out is something that we should all know and understand, which is you don't need the current year vehicle all the time to be your personal vehicle. And what we see is fiscal responsibility in other parts of Maryland that is not represented by Brandon Scott.
Larger SUVs are standard for government leaders at state and local levels. In Harford County, Executive Bob Casserly uses a 2021 Chevrolet Suburban bought by the previous administration for just under $64,000. But after trading in an older model, the county paid about $26,000.
Again, imagine how frustrating this report is coming on your screen as a Baltimore taxpayer. You end up looking at another comparable official, and what you ultimately end up finding out is that that comparable official is driving around in a $63,000 SUV, which by the way is a 2021, but even that cost is deceptive because the previous vehicle was traded in order to get that, only costing the taxpayer $26,000 out of pocket for that official to have that particular vehicle. And of course, that vehicle was purchased under a previous administration. And in fact, what we ultimately end up finding out is that this very much straight up and significantly more honest official than Brandon Scott was offered an upgrade, because it seems like this is what people try to get you to do when you come into office, and he turned it down because, again, it was unfair to the taxpayer.
That's my daily vehicle.
I sat down with Casserly, who says he turned down the offer of a new vehicle when he took office in December 2022.
My fleet folks came to me sometime in that first year and wanted to trade that one in for an upgraded version. So what was that going to cost? And they said the new vehicle, it's getting close to $100,000. And I said, yeah, we're going to keep driving this one. This one's fine.
When it comes to taxpayer money, Casserly says it's about function, not flash.
Again, we would all prefer for government officials to sound like this guy rather than Brandon Scott trying to justify having one of the most expensive vehicles in the state. Again, a Wagoneer that has been customized and tricked out, because obviously we want people to be responsible with their tax dollars. And the thing is that this particular official said something about how it's about substance and usability, not flash. But the thing is, Brandon Scott, even though he's not my most hated politician, and in fact, compared to previous Baltimore mayors that have said things like, we need to leave Black Lives Matter rioters room to destroy, he's a freaking angel.
And I've made it very clear that I worked with the police and instructed them to do everything that they could to make sure that the protesters were able to exercise their right to free speech. It's a very delicate balancing act, because while we tried to make sure that they were protected from the cars and the other things that were going on, we also gave those who wished to destroy space to do that as well.
But the thing is that Brandon Scott is riding on this cloud of unearned praise that he's getting from the left wing, because according to their theory of what's going on in the city of Baltimore, Brandon Scott is responsible for the historic reductions in homicide in that particular city. So obviously this guy feels like he's untouchable. But the thing is that praise and the arrogance associated with receiving it is completely unearned, because as we've talked about on this channel multiple times, Brandon Scott was sworn into office on December 8th, 2020. And if you look at homicides in 2021 and 2022, what you find out is that they're completely unchanged. And in 2023, that is when we see the decline. And the reason why homicides were completely unchanged is because Brandon Scott's criminal justice reforms that people are trying to pretend are working for obviously biased reasons weren't actually working. They weren't the thing that produced the change, because as we talked about on this channel multiple times, Baltimore's homicide got worse than, by the way, ever in the history of the city, not just since the 1990s, like we always talk about on the show, or the 1980s, worse than ever under the state's attorney, Marilyn Mosby, who was a corrupt individual who was ultimately indicted and convicted, who of course ran on a Black Lives Matter platform and wanted to free criminals from jail post the fervor of Freddie Gray. Now, of course, this is the Black Lives Matter effect that we saw nationwide in 2020, but encapsulated in one city from back in 2015. And if you look at the homicide numbers, what you ultimately end up discovering is that for the 8 years, including the first 2 years of Scott's administration, things got worse than they ever were. But then Ivan Bates came into office, somebody who I was incredibly skeptical of, because in a previous state's attorney election primary, he ran to the left of Mosby as an even bigger reformer. However, this time when he came around, he ran as a tough on crime prosecutor, and he has 100% delivered. Again, people don't realize what is going on in Baltimore. It's honestly a miracle. They were in and around 300 homicides per year, and now they're set to hit 100 for this year. And I know people like to say stats are being manipulated and whatnot, but I assure you that's not the case. Either you're seeing the dead bodies as a result of homicide, or you aren't. These are the most difficult stats for you to fake, and you're not going to be able to disappear 200 bodies that actually exist in a couple of years by juking the stats, even though that's something that Baltimore is famous for. But again, you don't have to take my word for it. It's not just Ivan Bates came in and things got significantly better in terms of homicides. Ivan Bates implemented a very clear agenda in order to address the homicide program, and it just makes sense that after that agenda was implemented, we started to see the results. See, Ivan Bates, unlike Marilyn Mosby, would target repeat gun offenders. So if you committed an armed robbery or an armed carjacking or any crime where you used a weapon during the commission of that crime, Ivan Bates would throw the book at you. And the reason why is because if you are committing armed robberies or armed carjackings, and again, in each and every one of those instances, you're using a gun in order to get what you want, it's only a matter of time if you keep releasing that individual before they ultimately end up shooting somebody, and then that becomes a murder. Ivan Bates very logically targeted those people, got them off the streets, so they weren't able to repeat offend. They weren't able to have one of those instances where they pull the trigger during an armed carjacking or an armed robbery, and thus the homicide rate drops significantly. So we have an exact policy tailored to address the exact problem in Baltimore, and guess what? As those people are getting locked up, held accountable, actually being prosecuted, the homicide rate is dropping to levels that nobody could have imagined was even possible in Baltimore. Again, under Marilyn Mosby, under the woke criminal justice reforms inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement post the Freddie Gray incident in Baltimore, we saw homicides shoot up to record highs, higher than the 1990s, higher than the 1980s. Again, not the worst since the 90s and the 80s, higher than the 90s and the 80s became the norm under the woke policies of Mosby, and Ivan Bates is the key factor right there. So yeah, if you're a Baltimore resident and you're thinking to yourself, yourself, well, the vehicle thing is no big deal, that he's just incinerating taxpayer money so he can be in luxury, because look at what he's doing for homicides. That is a completely wrong-headed association, because again, Brandon Scott has absolutely nothing to do with the drop in homicides. All the credit goes to Ivan Bates. And by the way, a great test on whether or not the criminal justice reforms are the key factor or Ivan Bates is look at who has the most jurisdiction over what. So I already told you about Ivan Bates' program where he can prosecute these repeat gun offenders because he has the most power in order to do those prosecutions. Well, Brandon Scott has the most power in terms of juvenile offenders. Ivan Bates is significantly limited due to Maryland state law, but Brandon Scott's rehabilitation programs and his midnight basketball and all that is more focused on the juveniles. Guess which crime has not reduced significantly since Ivan Bates has taken office? The category that he has the least control over and that the mayor is implementing his reforms in, which is the category of juvenile crimes.
In Anne Arundel County, Executive Stuart Pittman is assigned an electric 2023 Nissan, costing taxpayers about $45,700. Another $4,700 went into custom upgrades.
Now again, in context, which is what Brandon Scott asked for when looking at the vehicles of other people in other counties across the state of Maryland, what we find out is that his vehicle is obscenely expensive. You just heard right there that another county official ends up driving a $45,000 electric car that had about $5,000 in upgrades put into it. But to make matters even crazier, there are 5 county commissioners in another neighboring county in the state of Maryland that all share one vehicle at the cost of $23,000.
And in Carroll County, the 5 commissioners share one vehicle, a 2020 Ford Fusion Hybrid that cost just $23,700. A county spokeswoman tells Spotlight on Maryland the car is rarely used since most drive their own personal car.
Look, I know that there are a lot of problems in the state of Maryland. Obviously, you have a big budget deficit under Governor Wes Moore, and of course, you have the property tax assessments coming in this year, and they're raising people's property taxes without actually passing a bill to do so by exorbitant rates. But it is nice to see that all these different various counties are actually so much more frugal than in Baltimore County, where the mayor feels like he's entitled to incinerate over $250,000 on vehicles since he's taken office, because both his current vehicle and his backup vehicle were purchased at a time where Brandon Scott was the mayor of Baltimore. And obviously, this shows us that he doesn't give a damn about the taxpayer purse. He wants to spend money so he could ride around in style. But look over to these other counties that have far less corruption than Baltimore, and what you see is actually kind of too little money being spent on the vehicles for those officials, in my opinion. But of course, that results in them driving their own personal vehicles in order to, again, cover the costs of travel as commissioners or county officials or whatever position that they're actually in. So Brandon Scott telling us to go look and compare for ourselves completely backfired, embarrassingly so. And again, he's much more similar to the super mayor than an actual responsible public official worthy of praise.
Mayor Scott's office has yet to answer our email requesting comment on this story. We are still also waiting for a response on a records request asking for the purchase agreements of all vehicles used by Baltimore city officials to compare prices.
So look, we are definitely going to follow up on this particular segment because you already know that the city of Baltimore is insanely corrupt. Again, people have known this forever. The Wire is basically a documentary on how the city functions, that HBO series. But yeah, I will definitely be following up when that Freedom of Information Act request comes in and we end up seeing all the expensive vehicles that are owned by all of these Baltimore city officials, because in reality, they don't give a damn about your communities. And by the way, they incinerate your money while constantly pleading poverty to the public and saying that they need more money. And they talk about how the evil orange man, Donald J. Orange Man Bad Trump
simply hearing Trump bad over and over again
is going to take away federal funding from them, and that is going to leave their residents behind, even though they're proving unworthy of that funding right here before our very eyes. But you know what? Those are just my thoughts. I want to know what you guys think about this scandal down in the comments below, and of course about what's going on in terms of homicides and how Ivan Bates 100% deserves the credit. But as per usual, if you like this video, show them by leaving a like, subscribe for more content, follow me on my social media, support me via the support links in the description of this video. This has been me talking about Progressive Mayor Brandon Scott. Till next time.